everybody. Reporting to you again from the Glamour City, Hollywood.
But we do know that behavioral approaches, changes in dietary habits and in exercise, etc., can have profound improvements in these conditions. And so the naturally occurring molecules that are plant-based or fungal-based and part of our nutrition mimic some of these biological processes that lead to improvement in these diseases. And so I think that is really the interesting bit of these natural molecules, that they are polypharmacological by nature, meaning they bind to several high-value targets in the disease, and they can modulate the disease from various angles. And because they came up through coevolution with the animal kingdom, there's oftentimes a very great biological fit, meaning that many of these molecules that we're looking at specifically right now are extremely potent drugs at various targets. However, they are largely side effect free because they've always been part of our nutrition at lower concentration, but that allows us to create great drugs for these chronic diseases.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for our show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today, I'm joined by Lars Wilde, co-founder and CEO of Pangea Botanica. Welcome to the show today.
Thank you, Scott.
So you're a serial entrepreneur from Spring Lane, a German kitchen equipment online retailer, to German cooking magazine, to even Otto Wild Grillers, Emmanuel, and Compass Pathways. I wonder if you could tell us about your journey.
Yeah, very happy to. So, I stumbled into entrepreneurship, if you will. So my background is actually in finance, studied finance in grad school, and I went into private equity, spent 3 years there, and I got the chance to help the fund incubate a company, which became Europe's largest group of in vitro fertilization clinics. We scaled the whole group from 0 to 30,000 babies in a few years. It was an amazing ride, and I realized that I'm probably a better builder than private equity investor. And so I switched sides and became an entrepreneur, initially in tech and engineering. And as you were pointing out, I built 3 companies in that space. We sold one very successfully. The other 2 are very profitable now and growing. One was ready for IPO last year. And that was a great ride. And I actually liked it. But eventually I stumbled over the massive unmet medical need in mental health, which needed innovation. And at the time, the pharma industry has broadly turned their back to mental health care. That was in 2015, 2016, was just nothing that pharma was really interested in. But on the other hand, in academia, you had all that amazing research happening that really showed that there's a different path forward in mental health. And so I realized this was a massive opportunity to bridge that gap from academia into biotech development and then late stage clinical development and then partnerships with pharma. And so that led me to start Compass Pathways, which we scaled all the way from kind of preclin into phase 3 now in the US, Canada, and Europe, and several phase 2 studies in other interesting indication areas. So we're active in treatment-resistant depression, anorexia, bipolar disorder, PTSD, and a couple of other very difficult to treat indications. And that was my start into, I would say, biotech, into the biotech world. We took the company public in 2020 on NASDAQ to finance the phase 3 developments. And in parallel, I started another company called Atai Life Sciences, again, focused on mental health and addiction, where we took 7 different programs into clinical development now in different stages of development. We also took Atai public in 21, which is run by 3 good friends of mine. And I love the biotech field, and I realized there was really this interesting opening where you could actually take all the modern day tools we have, starting from AI, machine learning to in silico modeling, and then advanced med chemistry, all the way through the development path to develop great drugs inspired by nature. So effectively, we're going backwards in history because 65% of all small molecule drugs that are approved today are coming out of nature. And I realized this was still a massive untapped opportunity to develop. And so we picked a deep tech approach to that problem, which led us to start Pangea Botanica, which we are building today.
Okay, great. Thank you for that overview. Going back to Compass Pathway is that I think COVID has really opened the gateway or the floodgate really in terms of mental health. And there's many people that have certainly suffered during COVID and even post-COVID. And we're at a point in, I think, mainstream where mental health and addressing mental health has become much more accessible, whereas before it was somewhat tabooed. Compass pathway is interesting because at least the story that I've heard is that it's using compounds from wild mushrooms or certain hallucinogenic mushrooms, I should say. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And that probably also explains how I stumbled into this, because I lost a very good friend of mine in 2015, which led me to develop anxiety disorder and depression. And so I initially was on psychiatric medicines that didn't work for me. And eventually one of my venture capital investors at the time suggested I should look into psychedelic therapy, which sounded so strange to me because everything I knew and what the mainstream narrative at the time was, you take a psychedelic and it's going to tip you off the edge and you're going to become psychotic or you're going to develop schizophrenia. But then I found all this amazing research at the time that was happening at UCLA, Johns Hopkins, NYU, Imperial College London, the University of Zurich, that showed that psilocybin, the active moiety in so-called magic mushrooms, had profound efficacy in very difficult to treat mental health disorders. And so when I saw that, I embarked on my own journey and had my own psychedelic high dose experience, which solved my depression and anxiety in a single session. And that's how I decided that somebody needed to take this problem and solve it and actually take this out of academia and develop a drug approach with it. And so that's what we're doing. So, and when I say that, this is deeply embedded into psychotherapy. So this is part of a broader container to treat difficult to treat mental health disorders, including a preparation phase where the patient is prepared for the psychedelic therapy session, which then happens in a clinic with the help of a psychotherapist present. The patient undergoes the psychedelic treatment, and then in the week after has integration therapy to work with the learnings that are coming out of the psychedelic therapy approach. And we've seen tremendous results. Not only us, but there are other great groups that are also developing other drugs in the wider psychedelic field. So Johnson & Johnson Pharma arm has developed a drug called Spravato, which is hallucinogenic for treatment-resistant depression and suicidal ideation, which works really well. And then MDMA has cleared 2 very successful phase 3 programs for post-traumatic stress disorder, chronic post-traumatic stress disorder, and is likely to be approved by the FDA in the coming year. So we see completely paradigm shift away from chronic treatments to really using something that can help patients get better with a single or a few therapy sessions, but then for good to really work on their underlying traumatic and deep-rooted problems.
The first thing I'm going to say is that I think for centuries, indigenous people have actually known some of these properties. And it's exciting to see that the research field and the clinical field are starting to really examine and look for efficacy and actual empirical data and results around this. And certainly in the West Coast and Silicon Valley, not only hallucinogenic, but also microdosing has become quite popular. Again, not condoning it or saying anything, but there's certainly more research that's starting to go into that field. Let's first define ethnobotany and how is ethnobotanical knowledge of plants help identify new compounds for disease management and therapies?
Yeah, excellent question. So to pick it apart, ethno is really the study of the ethnicities and oftentimes tribes that have used botanicals, that's the ethnobotany part, the botany part at the end of it, to treat conditions they were experiencing. And so when you think about humanity since the dawn of it has found out that if they took certain herbal remedies or mushrooms, they experienced an improvement in the symptom clusters they were experiencing. And so, for example, that led to the discovery of indeed the use of hallucinogens to treat various mental health conditions. People also discovered, for example, that certain types of yeast would treat bacterial infections, which later we used we effectively backsolved discovering antibiotics through a similar effect. And so many of the drugs we're using today are based on this original insight that tribes had. Some of it is trial and error, but oftentimes also the tribes are very much in tune with their natural environment. And they're looking at how do animals behave if they fall sick. So if they develop tumors or if they have infectious diseases, how do they change their nutrition? And on the basis of these insights, then these tribes have discovered the use of a plant or a mushroom. And then there are ethnobotanists in the world that actually study these tribes. So oftentimes these are real adventurers affiliated with leading universities that go out in the world, live with these tribes, learn the language, and then study the use of plants and mushrooms in these communal tribes in order to study these medicinal remedies for the broader society. So that was really a way to discover drugs in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s. And then with modern day biotech coming online, people thought, okay, why do we need to send people into the forests of this world? If we can do in silico screening, high throughput screening, we don't need this anymore. And I think by now we realize that both are very valid approaches that lead to great drugs.
What are some of the challenges and perhaps maybe lacking with the current drug development process? And how can ethnobotanical approach help with that?
Yeah, great question. I would say there are certain diseases where we identify high value targets in oncology that are very relevant, that we can target very specifically with monoclonal antibodies, oftentimes with small molecules, etc. And there I would say probably ethnobotany is not the right approach. There we want to have a very selective, specific molecule that addresses exactly that disease target. However, when we talk about chronic diseases, the picture looks very different. We still don't know exactly what causes Alzheimer's disease. We don't exactly know what causes Parkinson's disease, but we do know that behavioral approaches, changes in dietary habits and in exercise, etc., can have profound improvements in these conditions. And so the naturally occurring molecules that are plant-based or fungal-based and part of our nutrition mimic some of these biological processes that lead to improvement in these diseases. And so I think that is really the interesting bit of these natural molecules, that they are polypharmacological by nature, meaning they bind to several high-value targets in the disease, and they can modulate the disease from various angles. And because they came up through coevolution with the animal kingdom, there's oftentimes a very great biological fit, meaning that many of these molecules that we're looking at specifically right now are extremely potent drugs at various targets. However, they are largely side effect free because they've always been part of our nutrition at lower concentration, but that allows us to create great drugs for these chronic diseases. And so I would say there are certain areas where these natural compounds as a starting point for drug development are very relevant. And then there are other areas that are better served with a complete in silico de novo drug design approach. And I don't think they are really competing.
People are starting to recognize that lifestyle changes, from everything from intermittent fasting to plant-based diet. It's really looking at things around prevention and in some cases actually remedying some of these underlying diseases. Whereas pharmaceutical approach with the typical chemical compounds that you're referring to, we're very much dependent upon it, but it doesn't really address the underlying issue, the disease itself. So if I'm diabetic, for instance, maybe taking metformin or whatever it is, isn't going to necessarily solve my problem. Whereas if I were to be plant-based, avoid things that would spike up my blood sugar level, for instance, I could start to correct that from an underlying perspective. So it is a very powerful story. And I wonder how the pharmaceutical industry is taking to heart some of these new biodiscoveries as it relates to plant-based compounds.
Yeah, I love the example that you use, Scott, because metformin is one such great example. It's one of the drugs that are derived from a plant that has been part of the arsenal of traditional medicines in France. And so eventually this molecule was improved, and the resulting molecule is metformin, which obviously is one of the greatest drugs developed ever for diabetes, and now also used in longevity, in the longevity field, based on the benefits on liver metabolism that's derived from the drug. And so, as you were saying, it doesn't solve the problem, but because it's a plant-based derivative, people could discover the effects of that plant. Now, to your question on how is pharma involved in this, when we look at the drugs that have been developed, we recently completed an analysis within the company to see how many drugs that have come to market over the last 15 years are nature-derived drugs. And so there's still a large number of drugs that are blockbuster drugs, all the way grossing up to 10 billion in peak sales, that have come out of nature. The interesting thing is oftentimes the pharma CEOs, if you talk to them and ask, where's your blockbuster drug coming from, he would tell you from the biotech that he bought it from, or from the acquisition or the licensing deal. So oftentimes even they don't remember where that small molecule or the small molecule antibody conjugate was coming from, because somewhere a great academic had an idea for a product, partnered with a small biotech company, that small biotech company merged with a large biotech company, and eventually pharma is very much focused today on phase 2, phase 3 and commercial. They in-license something. And so it's still a relevant play, but we said, look, why don't we flip it on its head? Instead of just waiting for these things to emerge out of serendipity, why don't we start with that and really figure out what are the diseases that benefit most from a nature-inspired product approach, and then specifically develop drugs based on that knowledge. And I think that is something very relevant for pharma. So I don't think I say too much, but we're in discussions on one of our programs in depth with a large pharma company that is very interested, where we are going after very severe chronic CNS disorders with amazing preclinical data. Pharma doesn't care that the molecule was inspired by nature. They care about that it works. And I think that is kind of the common language that we all speak. And that's how we're going to partner in the future.
So we're going to come back to the specific therapies and approaches that you're taking, but let's talk a little bit about your organization, because the way you've actually structured Pangea Botanica is interesting. It's somewhat like a holding group that incubates 4 different companies with the goal of incubating 3 new companies every year that's focusing on different compounds. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that, and what's the advantage of that approach versus a single entity that has just a broader product portfolio?
Yeah, great question. And I don't think people should think of us as being very different. I think at heart, we're a biotech company with a deep tech angle to it. However, we push down the IP on the various programs into dedicated sub-companies. And the goal here really is because we believe that when you look at the universe of pharma partners that would eventually develop these drugs in late-stage clinical trials and commercialization, they will be very interested in a certain compound class or disease area. And also this specific program needs a certain skill set. So when I look at our portfolio today, the common denominator is really central nervous system disorders. So everything is centrally mediated and the diseases we tackle. However, they are still very different. Some of them are going after neurodegenerative diseases, some after neurodevelopmental, some after traumatic brain injuries, and another one yet going after potentially mental health conditions. And so the skill set on the clinical development side is very different. And so we want to make sure that we can actually bring in teams at the program level that are incentivized, and that we have an entity that when the time is right, we can directly partner out or sell through M&A. And eventually the engine of creating these novel programs sits in Pangea Botanica, where we build the flywheel that will allow us to scale the company over time.
So while I agree with many of the things that you're referring to, certainly the uniqueness of the clinical experience and skill set that's needed, but why not structure under a single entity where there's shared services or capabilities so that there isn't redundancies, right? And then when those different outcomes or clinical results come out that show success, you can then at that point structure it in such a way that it's a lot easier to spin out or go public or whatnot. Why not take it from that point of view?
I think it's exactly how we do it, actually. So there are certain central services that will apply to all these programs. So starting from AI machine learning, so the discovery of the ideas, to medicinal chemistry and in silico modeling, med chemistry, and then the early preclinical development, that's all centrally organized. So only at the time when we actually become very disease specific, we hire dedicated people that are incentivized on the program level. So I think in that sense, it's exactly how you describe it. I guess the only differentiating factor is that we have that dedicated approach on the programs. And eventually, I believe the people that are driving the programs forward, they should be incentivized at the asset level, because that's where you're responsible. And I think that I've seen work over time, again, is people should be incentivized where they are spending their time in developing something.
Okay, makes sense. Let's talk about some of the disease areas.
Absolutely. So I think, again, just going back, all of the programs we're developing are central nervous system driven. What I mean by that is the drug's action unfolds in the brain. Now, that can then translate into different indication areas. And you mentioned, for example, sexual dysfunction. So we believe we have an amazing drug for the treatment of premature ejaculation, which is the largest of the male sexual dysfunctions. I think everybody's familiar with the success of Cialis and Viagra in erectile dysfunction. which is the second largest of these conditions. Premature ejaculation with a clinical diagnosis impacts roughly 7% of all men on this planet, meaning that from start of intercourse to ejaculation, it takes them less than 1 minute. Which initially, when we tell people that, they might think, okay, is that really a severe disorder? But when you look at the comorbidities of these patients are often depressed, anxious, they have problems holding long-term relationships. And the mechanism is twofold, where we have a molecule that has polypharmacology, that is a rapid-acting modulator of the serotonin transporter, which rapidly increases the concentration of serotonin in the synaptic cleft, which helps to extend the time to for the brain to initiate ejaculation. And then the other mechanism is we have a PDE4 inhibitor, which is part of the seminal vesicles that actually release sperm. And so we found this molecule based on anecdotal evidence from 2 tribes in South Africa that have used a certain plant for impulse control disorders, which is more hunger, thirst, attention, where they went onto hunts or depression, etc. And based on the mechanism, our scientists discovered that that would be a phenomenal treatment for that indication area. And then we ran that by our set of advisors and key opinion leaders. And the person we're developing this program with is the original program lead of the Viagra program. So we are taking the blueprint of the successful Viagra development program, developing that drug. Although I think by now we actually think the rest of the portfolio of drugs of similar structure would be phenomenal rapid-acting treatments for conditions, for example, like OCD or attention deficit. And so we have a vast pipeline in this specific compound set. You mentioned a couple of other disorders. So for example, inflammation. So there again, we're looking at the brain. And so we have 2 programs, I would say broadly around inflammation. One is progressive multiple sclerosis, where we believe we have a certain compound class that would be able to remyelinate axons, which are demyelinated in MS. And then the other condition that has a chronic inflammation response attached to it are severe headache disorders. So severe migraine subtypes, as well as chronic cluster headaches. And we believe we have a compound set that very effectively could prevent both migraine and cluster headache attacks by, amongst other things, lowering neuroinflammation.
So as I'm listening, one thing that's very notable is that if you look at a lot of the herbs as well as specialized plants from particularly forests, for instance, is that they have many different abilities to treat diseases. As you look at a compound class, it's not just this one particular disease, but you can actually start to address many different diseases just even within that class alone. Of course, the efficacy may vary, and you may have to have other additional compound classes to join that to increase the effectiveness. It's interesting because ultimately you're talking about, like I said, the nervous system and the brain. There's an opportunity to address a lot of different things from dieting, stress, ADHD, and of course, certain sexual dysfunctions, like I mentioned before. Let's talk about Pangea AI and how your platform not only discovers some of these things, but starts to map those natural compounds to these different diseases and starts to understand the efficacy.
Yeah, great question. Our big question was, how are we humans ever able to understand the vast body of knowledge that we have amassed over the last thousands of years on the use of natural products? Because no one in this world is able to know it all. And so the question was, is there a way that we can deploy technology to help us sort through the chaos of information or data? How can we take data and make information out of it? And so what our goal is eventually is to find the most promising small molecules in nature with evidence of safety and efficacy from human use that we can correlate to disease targets of high value in order to say, for example, here's a disease we care about. For example, ALS is one of the diseases that our team is very passionate about. And how do we find the most relevant compounds that have a good chance of treating ALS? And so for us, it starts with the disease, the high-value protein targets that are validated for the disease. And then what we've built is an engine that allows us to look at naturally occurring molecules. We look at all the traditional use data of plants. And so we can identify which of these natural molecules correspond to which natural plant. Has this been used in CNS conditions that share familiarity with the symptom set that would describe ALS? So that becomes our starting point. And then based on the chemical structures in these plant remedies, we can make use of existing chemistry databases with known chemical structures, and we know which of these known chemical structures bind to these high-value disease targets in ALS. And then we can make predictions which of these naturally occurring molecules with use data correspond to these known molecules and hit as many as possible of these high-value disease targets. And so that lets us sort down the data set from potentially billions of naturally occurring molecules to a manageable set of molecules. And then in terms of the solution, and it goes further through screening in terms of what are on-target, off-target effects that are undesirable, what are PK and ADME properties, and eventually the synthetic accessibility of the molecule. So can we actually make this molecule? Because right now our focus is very much on small molecules that we can synthesize, although we do have experience in the past with biosynthesis, as well as actually growing plants. So in the long horizon, we could actually also tackle probably larger molecules and use biosynthesis and plant growing to make these. At the moment, we want to be very hands-on and just focus on molecules we can make ourselves. And so that is how we deploy AI. Now, the last thing I'm going to say is that there are two elements that are dear to our hearts. A lot of scripture exists on plant use that is not available in a structured format. So one element is actually applying natural language processing in order to sort through the world's literature on natural remedies and translate that into a queryable format that can feed into our knowledge graph, which is a big project ongoing right now for our team. And the other area is really identifying known and unknown metabolites in plant material. So imagine we know a plant that has been used traditionally to treat schizophrenia, for example, but no one has ever analyzed that plant. So what we can do is we can actually apply our AI to LC-MS, MS outputs and identify known structures and unknown structures in these plant materials. This process could have taken years in the past for chemists to figure out what is actually in that plant. And so we bring this down to minutes now, which allows us to then feed the database with novel structures.
So we only have just 1 minute. My final question for you is, how is your platform different from, let's say, Brightseed's Forager AI computational platform that identifies bioactives and then correlates it to the health benefits?
Yeah, I think a different approach. So for us, it's really about treating diseases and really using that human evidence of safety and efficacy. Because when you think about why do drugs fail, they're either not safe or they're not efficacious. So for us, it's really about using that human use data as a starting point to find these molecules. And then our focus is on derivatizing them and creating therapeutics from them. So I think it's a very complementary approach because Brightseeds is very much focused on health products, which makes a lot of sense. As you were saying, the things we eat become part of us and prevent diseases from occurring. However, we are much more about how do we treat diseases when they have occurred and how do we change the odds of actually successfully developing a drug over time.
Well, the last comment that I'm going to give is that biotech as an industry has been challenged, I would say, for the last several years in terms of just kind of downward pressure. And certainly with the recent general recessionary pressures and the volatility out there, it's really compounded that. So the fact that you guys are focused on clinical approach and the different gates that are needed to get to commercialization, again, I'm all for disease management and therapies, but it really does pose some challenges. So I wonder if you got just real quickly have thoughts around how to navigate in the next 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, great question. I think we're probably a bit of an outlier, I would say, because we see strong interest in the company, both from VCs and from pharma partners. And I think the reason for that is that our approach is very de-risked. Going back to the point of we start with human use evidence of safety and efficacy. So if you compare that to the de novo drug discovery program, we should be much more reliably be able to actually get drugs across the finish line. And that's really where people are nervous today. When you think about platform companies that have a technology idea, but that are very early stage in discovery, that is something that is very difficult to finance these days. Whereas actually compounds that have great evidence that are moving into the clinic, that is something that investors like. And I think we've shown that we can reliably do that. So for example, in our first program in premature ejaculation, we went from idea to in the clinic in less than 2 years. And we spent less than $8 million to get to that point, which if you compare that to the average drug discovery program is record speed and record use of investor money to get to that point. And I think that resonates quite a bit. And then obviously, as interest rates will come down in the next 2 years, I think biotech will have a great revival because obviously, medicines is something that humanity will need forever. And so I don't think the biotech industry will go away.
So with that, I have been joined by Lars Wilde, CEO of Pangea Botanica. Thank you for joining today.
Scott, thanks so much for having me.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.